July 1st, 1944. 5:40 in the evening. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stood at the window of his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a grand château west of Paris that had once belonged to French kings. The evening light filtered through tall windows onto maps covered with red and blue markings showing the disposition of forces across Normandy. 25 days had passed since the Allied landings. 25 days of watching the situation deteriorate. 25 days of issuing orders that could not change the outcome. 25 days of speaking truths that no one in Berlin wanted to hear. The telephone rang. On the other end was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, calling from the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's fortified headquarters hidden in the forests of East Prussia, over 1,000 miles away. Keitel's voice carried the nervous tension of a man who would have to relay whatever answer he received to a leader increasingly detached from reality. "What should we do?" Keitel asked. Von Rundstedt was 68 years old, the senior field marshal in the German army, a professional soldier who had served for over 50 years. He had commanded the conquest of Poland. He had led Army Group South through Ukraine. He had studied war his entire adult life. He knew exactly what needed to be done. "End the war, you idiots! What else can you do?" The line went silent. Keitel said nothing. There was nothing to say. Von Rundstedt had spoken the truth that everyone in the German High Command knew, but no one dared to articulate. The war was lost. Continuing to fight would only determine how completely Germany would be destroyed before the inevitable surrender. Within 48 hours, von Rundstedt was relieved of command. The war would continue for another 10 months. Millions more would die. German cities would be reduced to rubble. And the man who had seen the truth, spoken it plainly, and been removed for his honesty, would watch from retirement as everything he predicted came to pass, exactly as he had foreseen. Gerd von Rundstedt was born on December 12, 1875, into a world that no longer existed by 1944. His family had produced officers for the Prussian and German states for generations. Military service was not a career choice. It was a family tradition, an obligation of class, an identity passed from father to son like an inheritance. He entered the German army as a cadet in 1892 at age 16. By 1914, he was a captain serving on staff during the Great War. He spent that war learning the art of moving large formations, coordinating artillery and infantry, managing the logistics that determined whether armies advanced or starved. After Germany's defeat in 1918, von Rundstedt stayed in the small professional army permitted by the Versailles Treaty. He rose steadily through the ranks. By 1936, he was one of the senior generals in the German military. Von Rundstedt was not a Nazi. He never joined the party. He never expressed enthusiasm for National Socialist ideology. Among fellow officers, he called Hitler the Bohemian Corporal, a reference to Hitler's modest rank in the Great War and his Austrian origins. But von Rundstedt was also a man of his time and class. He was willing to serve whoever controlled the German state, regardless of their methods or goals. When Hitler launched the war, von Rundstedt fought it. His campaign in Poland in September 1939 was a masterpiece. His forces covered 200 miles in 2 weeks. The campaign was over in 35 days. In May 1940, he led the crucial thrust through the Ardennes that broke France in 6 weeks. In June 1941, he commanded Army Group South in the invasion of the Soviet Union, capturing Kiev in one of the largest encirclements in military history. Von Rundstedt's reputation as one of Germany's finest commanders was beyond question. But he also saw something that the ideologues in Berlin refused to see. The Soviet Union was not collapsing. New divisions appeared to replace those destroyed. The quick victory Hitler had promised was not coming. In December 1941, von Rundstedt ordered a withdrawal from Rostov that Hitler had forbidden. He offered his resignation. Hitler accepted it. For the first time, the Field Marshal learned what happened to commanders who told Hitler things he did not want to hear. In March 1942, Hitler recalled von Rundstedt and appointed him Commander-in-Chief West. His job was to prepare the defense of the Atlantic coast from Norway to Spain. Nearly 3,000 miles of coastline. The Allies would eventually invade. Everyone knew it. The question was where and when. Von Rundstedt commanded dozens of divisions on paper. In reality, many were understrength, undertrained, or filled with soldiers who had no business on a front line. Some divisions consisted of older men conscripted in their 40s. Others contained Osttruppen, soldiers from conquered Soviet territories whose reliability was questionable. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority. The Kriegsmarine had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. Von Rundstedt was being asked to hold a continent with an army already bleeding to death in the east against enemies who controlled the sea and the sky. He understood the mathematics, but he was a soldier. Soldiers do their duty. The fundamental problem was resources. Germany could not defend everywhere at once. Decisions had to be made. Forces had to be concentrated. Von Rundstedt wanted to hold his panzer divisions in reserve, positioned well inland. Classical military doctrine: wait until the enemy commits himself, then mass your strength and counterattack. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B under von Rundstedt, disagreed completely. Rommel had fought the British and Americans in North Africa. He knew what Allied air power could do. He had watched his supply convoys burn on desert roads. He had seen tanks destroyed by fighter bombers before they could reach the battlefield.
Rommel believed the invasion had to be defeated in the first hours, on the beaches, before the Allies could consolidate. Every tank, every gun, every soldier had to be as close to the water as possible. The first 24 hours will be decisive, Rommel told his staff. It will be the longest day. Both men had valid points. A compromise might have worked. But Hitler chose the worst possible option. He kept direct control of key Panzer divisions himself. The Panzer Lair Division and 12th SS Panzer Division could not move without Hitler's personal authorization. This meant that when the invasion came, the men who could see what was happening would have to ask permission from a man 1,000 miles away who could see nothing at all. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Allies landed on 5 beaches across 50 miles of Normandy coastline. 156,000 men came ashore on the first day. 11,000 aircraft supported them. Nearly 7,000 ships delivered them. The largest amphibious invasion in human history. Von Rundstedt learned of the landings around 0630 hours. The scope was immediately clear. This was not a raid. This was the invasion. He immediately requested the release of the Panzer reserves. Every hour of delay allowed the Allies to strengthen their beachheads. Every hour mattered. The request went to Hitler's headquarters at the Berghof in Bavaria. Hitler had stayed up late watching newsreels. His physician had given him a sleeping pill. His staff, terrified of his rages, refused to wake him. The panzers sat motionless, their engines cold, their crews waiting for orders that did not come. Hours passed. The Allies consolidated. More men came ashore. The beachheads linked up. The window for a decisive counterattack began to close. When Hitler finally woke around noon, he still hesitated. He was convinced Normandy was a diversion. Allied deception operations had convinced him that the real invasion would come at Pas de Calais, where a phantom army under General Patton supposedly waited. Hitler refused to release the reserves until he was certain. By the time the panzers finally received authorization in late afternoon, Allied aircraft were waiting. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to counterattack on D-Day, launched a disjointed attack that evening. By nightfall, it had withdrawn after losing 70 of its 124 tanks. The moment to throw the Allies back into the sea had passed. It would never return. The first week after D-Day confirmed von Rundstedt's worst fears. The Allies were not going to be pushed back. They were establishing themselves, building up forces, preparing to break out into the French interior. German counterattacks failed one after another. The 12th SS Panzer Division launched attacks that caused heavy casualties, but failed to dislodge the beachhead. Panzer Lair was fed into the fighting piecemeal and began suffering irreplaceable losses. Reinforcements were delayed by Allied air attacks on French railways. Divisions that should have reached Normandy in days took weeks. On June 17th, von Rundstedt and Rommel met with Hitler at Margeval, a command bunker near Soissons. It was the first time Hitler had been to France since 1940. He had refused to visit the front. Now he came only to a bunker far behind the lines. Hitler arrived looking pale and exhausted, his hands trembling visibly. He walked with a stoop. His famous energy had given way to nervous agitation. Rommel spoke with brutal honesty. The front was barely holding. Casualties were running at 2,500 men per day. Replacements arrived at perhaps 1,000. The Allies had complete air superiority. Rommel urged Hitler to consider the political implications. If the war could not be won militarily, perhaps a diplomatic solution should be sought. Hitler erupted. He accused Rommel of defeatism. He insisted new weapons would turn the tide. The V-1 flying bombs had just begun hitting London. Wonder weapons would change everything. He demanded that the troops fight for every inch of ground. No retreats, no withdrawals. Will would overcome material disadvantage. The conference ended without resolution. Von Rundstedt and Rommel returned to France knowing they had failed to change anything. They had presented the facts. They had been ignored. The situation deteriorated rapidly. On June 26th and 27th, Cherbourg fell. The deepwater port would soon allow the Allies to pour supplies into France at industrial scale. On June 29th, von Rundstedt and Rommel met with Hitler again at the Berghof. They flew from France to Germany, leaving the crumbling front behind. Rommel again laid out the situation plainly. The front cannot hold indefinitely. The troops are fighting bravely, but they cannot fight tanks with rifles. They cannot stop aircraft with machine guns. The only question is whether we lose the war slowly or quickly. Hitler responded with familiar arguments. New divisions would arrive. Wonder weapons would devastate England. The alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union would collapse. Von Rundstedt finally spoke. The war in the West is lost. Not losing, lost. The question is not whether Germany will be defeated, but when and at what cost. Every day the war continues, more German soldiers die for nothing. Hitler stared at him. The room fell silent.
Then Hitler began shouting. Accusations of cowardice, defeatism, betrayal. The meeting ended without resolution. Von Rundstedt and Rommel flew back to France knowing they had spoken the truth and been rejected for speaking it. 2 days later came the telephone call from Keitel. "What should we do?" "End the war, you idiots. What else can you do?" The next day, July 2nd, Hitler issued the dismissal order. Von Rundstedt was told to go home and await further orders. He had spoken the truth, and truth was not tolerated. What followed proved every word von Rundstedt had spoken to be accurate. Field Marshal Günther von Klug arrived confident he could succeed where von Rundstedt had failed. Within days, he understood the reality was exactly as von Rundstedt had described. On July 20, 1944, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a bomb in a briefcase at the Lair during a military briefing. The bomb exploded at 12:42 in the afternoon, killing 4 people, but Hitler survived. A heavy oak table had shielded him from the blast. The conspiracy collapsed within hours. Stauffenberg was shot by firing squad at midnight, shouting, "Long live sacred Germany," with his last breath. Others were hanged with piano wire. Nearly 5,000 people would eventually be executed. Rommel was implicated in the conspiracy. He had known about the plot and had not reported it. He was offered a choice: face the People's Court, where conviction and execution were certain, or take poison and die as a hero with his family protected. On October 14, 1944, 2 generals arrived at Rommel's home with the poison. He told his wife and son what was about to happen. He said goodbye, walked to the waiting car, and swallowed the cyanide capsule. He was 52 years old. The man who had understood the situation better than almost anyone else was dead because he had been right. Von Klug fared no better. When Hitler suspected him of attempting to negotiate with the Allies, he was recalled. On August 19th, on the road back to Germany, he pulled his car aside and swallowed cyanide. He was 61. The pattern was unmistakable. Every senior commander who saw the truth and spoke it was destroyed. Remarkably, von Rundstedt's story was not over. In September 1944, with Germany facing invasion from both east and west, Hitler recalled him. The old field marshal was brought back to the position he had been dismissed from. Why? Because there was no one else. The competent generals were dead, imprisoned, or disgraced. Von Rundstedt accepted. He was 69, tired, suffering from heart problems. He had no illusions. "My job is to preside over a catastrophe, not to prevent one." In December 1944, Hitler launched his last great offensive in the Ardennes. Von Rundstedt had opposed it from the beginning. The forces were insufficient, the logistics impossible. The fuel did not exist to reach Antwerp. The offensive went forward anyway. It achieved surprise. The Americans were caught unprepared. A bulge 50 miles deep formed in their lines. But von Rundstedt was right about everything that mattered. The offensive ran out of fuel before reaching its objectives. German tanks stood motionless, empty. When the skies cleared, Allied air power returned with devastating effect. By late January, the Germans were back where they started, having lost 100,000 men and 800 tanks. The Ardennes accomplished nothing except to accelerate Germany's defeat. In March 1945, von Rundstedt was dismissed for the final time after Allied forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact. He had nothing to do with the failure, but he was the senior commander. He went home. His war was over. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Hitler was dead, having shot himself in his Berlin bunker as Soviet forces closed in. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. Von Rundstedt was captured by American forces on May 1st at a hospital where he was being treated for heart problems. He was held as a prisoner of war and treated with courtesy due his rank and age. In 1949, he was charged with war crimes related to the execution of Allied commandos under Hitler's infamous Commando Order. The trial never happened. His health deteriorated so severely that he could not appear in court.
The charges were dropped. He spent his final years in quiet retirement near Celle. He lived with his wife, avoiding public attention, giving occasional interviews to historians. He never wrote memoirs. He never sought to explain himself. Gerd von Rundstedt died on February 24, 1953, at age 77. He was buried with military honors. Over 2,000 mourners attended. The question historians have debated ever since is what von Rundstedt's story tells us about truth-telling in organizations. Some argue he was just another general who served a criminal regime. His aristocratic contempt for Hitler did not prevent him from serving faithfully. His skill enabled atrocities he never personally ordered, but certainly facilitated. Others argue he represented the tragedy of the professional soldier trapped in a criminal system. He was not a true believer, but a craftsman who served the state without questioning its purposes. Perhaps both interpretations contain truth. Perhaps von Rundstedt was simultaneously a skilled professional, a passive enabler of evil, and a clear-eyed realist who saw truths that others refused to see. What is certain is that 25 days after D-Day, he understood the war was lost beyond any hope of recovery. He said so directly, and everything that happened afterward confirmed his judgment. The Battle of the Bulge was a futile waste. The defense of the Rhine bought nothing but time for more destruction. Every day the war continued after July 1, 1944, cost lives without changing the outcome. Von Rundstedt saw this clearly. He spoke the truth, and he was destroyed for speaking it. The deeper lesson is about how organizations fail when they punish honesty. Hitler's Germany was a system optimized for self-deception. Good news flowed upward, bad news was filtered, softened, or blocked. Officers who reported honestly were accused of defeatism. The result was a command structure progressively more disconnected from reality. This pattern appears throughout history. Corporations that punish honest assessments, governments that promote officials who agree and marginalize those who question, militaries that silence officers who challenge accepted doctrine. The short-term comfort of conformity creates long-term catastrophe when reality finally imposes itself. Von Rundstedt's words, "End the war, you idiots," were not merely an assessment of Germany's military situation. They were an indictment of a system that had made honest assessment impossible. They were a cry of frustration from a professional who had mastered a demanding craft, only to watch it destroyed by amateurs who believed will could substitute for reality. The fools did not end the war. They continued fighting for 10 more months. They presided over the destruction of their country. They sent hundreds of thousands to die in battles that could not be won. And when it was finally over, the survivors asked how it had happened. Part of the answer is that the people who knew the truth, the people who dared to speak honestly, were systematically removed. They were dismissed, arrested, executed, or driven to suicide. And the people who replaced them told comfortable lies until there was nothing left to lie about. Von Rundstedt saw the end coming 25 days after D-Day. He said so plainly. He was removed for his honesty, and Germany burned for another 10 months because no one in power could bear to hear what he had to say.